I just want to take just a moment. Brother Lynn mentioned, Charlie Kirk, and I just want to say a couple of things about that just real fast. I can say undoubtedly in my lifetime, there have been two events that have kind of seemed like an actual watershed moment. That word gets used a lot, and I think it's overdone, but 9/11, watershed moment, I don't think anybody disagrees with that. And then this Charlie Kirk shooting has seemed to be a watershed moment. I don't know how much everybody in here has been following this, but I can say what I have been seeing is a movement. I have seen a lot of people on social media and things like this who have made statements of, whereas I might have been on the fence or whatever, I have seen the evil that has been permeating because of this event. And so here's what I want to say just quickly about this. God is sovereign. Charlie Kirk, and I mentioned this Wednesday, I didn't agree with every word that came out of the guy's mouth. I agreed with most of it. I didn't agree with every word of it. But he undeniably was a Christian. He undeniably loved his Savior. He talked about him everywhere he went, talked about him at that event before he got shot. And God knew what he was doing to allow this event to take place. Did he cause the evil that made it happen? No. He allowed it. And he allowed it. I say this, y'all probably heard me say this, every time that somebody dies, I always pray that God will use that particular death as a means to draw people to him. And I believe that's what's going to happen. And so at a moment like this, when people are, and I'll say, there's a lot of people who are very scared. I've seen a lot of that too. People are scared because of this evil ideology that has been not just allowed to take place, but pushed. And it has been intentionally pushed upon our kids. For everything we know at this point is that this kid seemed fairly like a normal teenager until he got to the university, where he was radicalized at this university. That seems to be the case. Facts may come out to change that. But they are pushing this evil ideology because our government wants people radicalized to the point that they are willing to commit acts like this, because if they can get us fighting one another, that gives them more power. And so we have to be careful about this. But one thing that I just want to say before we get into the text this morning is that when an event like this takes place, and because of social media, probably more people have seen the death of Charlie Kirk than have seen the death of their own loved ones. It's out there. I know, even though I haven't wanted to see the video, I have seen the video more times than I ever wanted to see the video. But people are asking questions, and Christians need to be able to answer those questions. Peter says to be ready to give an answer. And so Christians at this particular point, we need to be ready. And how are you ready? By knowing what this book says. And so we need to be ready. And I can't think of a better way to do that than to just see what the text actually says. So with all that being said, Romans chapter 4, as we have been making our way through this just amazing and incredible, the crown jewel of the writing of Paul, you could say. Here we find ourselves in Romans chapter 4, verse 13. So Romans chapter 4, verse 13, it says, "For the promise that he," and he there is speaking of Abraham, "for the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise is made of none effect. Because the law worketh wrath, for where no law is, there is no transgression. Therefore it is of faith, that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations, before him whom he believed, even God, who quickeneth the dead, and calleth those things that be not as though they were." And we'll stop right there this morning. And so we've been talking about this for weeks now. Paul has been working through this argumentation of salvation by faith apart from works. And we have seen the various means and ways in which he has done this. At the beginning of chapter 4, he has used both Abraham and David as examples of a proof of the witness of the law and the prophets, as he talked about in chapter 3, essentially as a way to say all the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, each has been around since the time of Abraham, since the fall, we should say. And so here, he not only continues to speak about this faith, which we'll see this, but he also shows the inability of the law to confer the promises of God, but he also shows that grace is necessary. And so when we talk about salvation, we understand that salvation happens by faith, and it happens by grace, right? Salvation is by faith alone, through grace alone. And so we understand this, and we'll see this in our text this morning. And so as we begin here in verse 13, in the previous section last week, we saw that Paul showed Abraham to be the father of all those who believe, right? And this is what he talked about in verses 11 and 12. That he's the father of all those who are his physical descendants, but he's the father of those who believe. And then he actually makes the statement that we saw last week that even though, yes, he is physically the father of all of his seed, he's really only your father, even if you are the physical seed of Abraham, if you walk in the steps of what? His faith, not his works, but if you walk in the steps of his faith. And so as we talked about, that was quite the offensive statement for Paul to make to the Jewish people who would have read this. This was a very bold statement. And so here he continues this, and he says, for the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. And so Paul then is answering the inevitable question that would come by the Jew as to why Abraham would not be considered the father of the Jews through the law or through circumcision, or again, just because he's their physical father, their physical descendant. And so remember, the typical Jewish thinking was that Abraham stood as the prototype of righteousness that was received by faithfulness, i.e. works, and not faith. Right? And they actually had rabbinical writings and things that talked about this. I've showed you some of those in the weeks previous. But that Abraham's works and the things that he did, he believed God, but yes, he also left his land, and he came to the promised land. He worked, and that he took Isaac up to the mount to sacrifice. He did all these things, and they said that his works were the prototype of how righteousness was received. And so Paul's omission of the law then, or that which gives us what works ought to be done, Paul's omission of the law as the means by which Abraham is the spiritual father, even of the Jews, was offensive and needed an explanation. And so that's what he does here. And so God promised Abraham would be the heir of the world. And there's a lot of questions about what exactly Paul means by that, but I don't think it's difficult to ascertain. In fact, I think it's very simple. God promised Abraham that he would make of thee a great nation, Genesis 12. He promised that he would make Abraham a father of many nations, in Genesis 17. In fact, that's referenced here in our text. Back in Genesis 12, he promised that through Abraham, that shall all families of the earth be blessed. Right? And so it's not difficult to understand why he would be called the heir of the world. Abraham is not only the father of the Jews, but he's the father of the Arabs as well through Ishmael. And so when you understand his progeny, it's vast and it's wide. God promised that he would have sons as the sand that is on the seashore. Right? And so we understand that he is the spiritual father of all who have faith. And so there are a vast, uncountable number of people who can trace their lineage back to Abraham, either physically or spiritually. And so it's easy to see how God fulfilled this particular promise and what the promise was. He is the heir of the world. And so here then, Paul takes it all the way back to the promise itself. And so the promise was not given to Abraham or his seed through the law, but specifically through the righteousness of faith. Through the righteousness of faith. Now, Jesus makes a rather remarkable statement in John chapter 8. He says, your father, he was speaking to a group of Jews, your father Abraham rejoiced to say that Abraham saw you. And that's when he makes the statement, the clear statement in all the Gospels where Jesus claims his own divinity. And he says, before Abraham was, I am. But here in John 8:56, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day. He saw it and was glad. Now here's what he meant. In some sense, and with the limited knowledge that not only Abraham had, but all the Old Testament saints had, he was able to look forward to the coming of Christ, and he rejoiced, and he had faith that what God promised would come to pass. Okay, and so God promised Abraham that through his seed, all the families of the world would be blessed. Now, we understand that to be a messianic promise. I believe that Abraham understood that to be a messianic promise, and that Abraham, through faith in the promises of God, looked forward to the day when Christ would come. We, in faith, look back to the day when Christ did come. But Abraham was able to look forward, and he rejoiced. Why did he rejoice? Because he had faith that what God promised would come to pass. It's not that he hoped it would come to pass. He had tremendous and absolute faith that because God said it, it would be so. And so it was faith in the promises of God. Now, we're told this in Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews 11 is the great chapter of faith where it talks about the faith of the Old Testament saints. And right after talking about Abraham and Sarah, it says in Hebrews 11:13 that these all died in faith. And then it says this, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims of the earth. And so they saw that the promises were far off, but they were still persuaded of them. They still embraced them. And so even though, Abraham's knowledge of the Messiah is vastly short of what we have, just because we have the Scriptures and we have the benefit of time and history on our side, but that doesn't mean that his faith in the Messiah is any different than ours. He believed that what God said would come to pass. Our faith is the same. And so, again, salvation from the fall has been by faith. And so when you read the account of God's promises to Abraham, you go back to Genesis 12, you go back to Genesis 15, Genesis 17, all those times where the promise was given to Abraham and then referenced again and again and again in the Genesis account, nowhere do you see a condition applied. Not once do you see a condition applied to the promises that God gave to Abraham, meaning it was an unconditional promise. In fact, one of the clearest places to see this is in Genesis chapter 15. And so the original promise to Abraham is given in chapter 12. In chapter 15, God kind of re-ups the promise with Abraham. He references it again. And then we see this odd thing take place where Abraham takes some animals, cuts them in half, and then lays the half kind of side by side so that there's kind of a pathway in between them. Now, this was an ancient covenant. This was an ancient practice where people would do this, and they would cut these animals in half. They would walk together through those animals. Essentially, it was a way to say, I'm going to keep my side of the agreement, you're going to keep your side of the agreement, and if one of us break our agreement, let what happened to these animals happen to us. Essentially, that's kind of what it was saying. It was kind of a graphic way to say, oh, I will keep my end of this agreement. But the interesting thing that happens is that God puts Abraham to sleep, and God goes through those animals by himself. Abraham doesn't go through. And so what God is telling him is this promise, this covenant, it does not depend upon you. It depends upon me, and depends upon my, what you might call, works. It depends on my faithfulness to you. All you have to do is have faith, right? There's no works involved on your side. Now, there's a big difference between me promising my child a gift and then me promising my child a gift if they continue to be obedient. Right? On one, they can have faith that they're going to receive it no matter what. On the other, they might get it, they might not. Right? And so there's a difference in the two. And so with the first, what do? They simply depend upon or in faith for the receiving of the gift. With the second, they have to work for the gift. Right? And so the promises to Abraham were unconditional. He received them through faith. The second would be some kind of works-based system, which God has never instituted. And so with that in mind, Paul adds this. He says, for if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void. And then he says this, and the promise is made of none effect. I want to quote Ben Witherington here. He says, if the promise had been given on the basis of law or as a quid pro quo for works of the law, such as circumcision, then it would be a contractual agreement, and grace and faith would not enter into it. Thus Paul reasons, if the heirs were heirs on the basis of the law and works of the law, then faith and the promise would be, in effect, nullified. Faith, grace, and promise stand on one side of the ledger, and works, law, and sin stand on the other. And so why this is fascinating is because, kind of in an interesting twist here, Paul reveals then that by the Jews insisting upon the law as kind of this end-all be-all, and the keeping of the law as the means of receiving righteousness and entering heaven, in particular circumcision, but the law in general, but by their insisting upon this so much of works instead of Abraham's faith as the basis of righteousness, the Jews were actually making the promises that they held so dear, the promises that constituted them as a called apart special people of God, that they were making these of none effect. And so God gave them the law for a purpose. We'll talk about this in a moment. He gave them the law for a purpose, but the law was never that which was to save them. And so the Jews, instead of holding on to the faith of Abraham, held on to the works of Abraham. And they said, well, it's works that make us stand apart. It's works that makes us receive righteousness. It's works that do all this. And so here's Paul saying, no, it's not works, it's faith. If it were of works, you would have made the covenant, the promises of God, of none effect. And furthermore, I would add this, outside of Christ, no one has ever kept the law. Nobody has ever done this. Nobody has ever kept the law perfectly. Nobody even got close to keeping the law perfectly. And so if they want to claim that the law is the means by which the promises were to be fulfilled, they were placing upon it impossible conditions because nobody was able to do this. The fact that the tabernacle and then later on the temple consistently ran red with the blood of the sacrifices was a testimony that nobody was keeping it. It was a testimony that nobody could keep it. And so by insisting upon the law or works instead of faith, they were trying to say, God, we want the promises and all the blessings and everything given, promised to Israel, we want these based on works. And what they're wanting, what they were desiring was something that was impossible. And Paul says, you don't understand that what you are desiring would be your own doom. That's what you're wanting. That's what you're seeking after. Instead of just accepting the far easier option, which is the faith of Abraham, not the works of Abraham. And then he gets to verse 15. So verse 15 is kind of the key here. And so he says, because the law worketh wrath, and then he says this, for where no law is, there is no transgression. For where no law is, there is no transgression. And so the Jews were expecting the law. And when I say the law, I mean essentially their work in trying to keep the law. Okay? And so the Jews were expecting the law to bring righteousness, when in reality, Paul says it doesn't bring righteousness. The law brings wrath. You're expecting the law to save you, when in fact the only thing the law can do is condemn you. Right? You're holding on to that which you think is going to bring you hope and deliverance, and the only thing it's going to bring you is condemnation and judgment. Right? That's what you're trying to hold on to. And so why? The question is why? Because the law makes people accountable for their sin, because it shows them what sin is. It shows them what sin is. Now, let's just think about this logically. If there were no rules, there would be no rule breakers. Just it's a logical argument. If I never told my kids, you can't do this, then I could never get them in trouble, right? I could never say, well, what you did was wrong if I never explained to them what is wrong. If our country had no laws, there would be no criminals. No judge could say you deserve to go to prison, right? The person could say, well, what did I do that is against the law? There are no laws. If there was no law of God, there would be no sin. That's Paul's argument here. Now, I need to make some things clear here. That does not mean there would be no wrongdoing. Even if I never explained right and wrong to my children, if I never gave them a single rule, that doesn't mean that my children are perfect. That doesn't mean that they never would have done wrong. I'll explain this in a minute. It would mean that there was no transgression. Okay, I'll explain that in a second. Romans 1 makes clear that God is still just in punishing those who sin without the law. The Gentiles didn't have the law, but they still had the law of God written in their hearts, as we're told in Romans 1, or Romans 2, rather. And so here we understand that just because there is no law does not mean there is no sin, but you could say that there is no just means of punishing that sin. However, for those who sin with the law, they willingly transgress against the law that they believe in and that they have willingly submitted themselves to. So here's what transgression is. Transgression is a little different A little different definition than sin. Sin is just breaking the law of God. A transgression is knowingly breaking a law of God. A Gentile, prior to the New Testament being written, could sin in that they have broken the moral law of God that's universal, written on their hearts and everything. But a Jewish person transgressed when they had black and white written for them, don't do this, and they do it. Or they have black and white written for them, you should do this, and they don't, right? We have what are called for sins of commission and sins of omission. I have a sin of commission when the Bible says don't and I do. I have a sin of omission when the Bible says do and I don't, okay? And so if I have a rule written out for me and I break it, that's transgression. If I know what I'm doing is wrong, that's a transgression. And so here, again, Paul's telling them, you're trying to hold on to this law, which you have transgressed against, because it told you not to do things you did, it told you to do things you didn't, and you're hoping, against hope, that is going to save you, when in essence, it can only condemn you. And so we need to understand, again, the law, because the law doesn't cause sin. This is not Paul's argument. The law does not cause sin, it reveals sin. Right? When God says don't murder, it doesn't mean that because he said don't murder, now murder is wrong. Murder was wrong before the 10 Commandments were given. Okay? And so murder has always been wrong. The law just revealed what was wrong. Now, I'm going to look ahead just a little bit, but turn over to Romans chapter 7. We'll get there eventually, but Romans chapter 7, start in verse 7. Paul says this. He says, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid. He says, nay, I had not known sin, but by the law. For I had not known lust, except the law had said, thou shalt not covet. But sin, taking occasion by the commandment, wrought in me all manner of concupiscence, for without the law sin was dead. For I was alive without the law once, but when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. And the commandment which was ordained to life, I found to be unto death. For sin, taking occasion by the commandment, deceived me, and it slew me. He says, wherefore the law is holy, and the commandment holy, and just and good. Was then that which is good made death unto me? God forbid, but sin, that it might appear sin, working death in me by that which is good, that sin by the commandment might become exceedingly sinful. And so, in essence, what he says there in verse 7, so shall we say the law is sin? No. He says, I had not known sin, but by the law. That doesn't mean he wasn't committing sin, but now, because of the law, he knows it's sin, right? And so that's the difference. He knows it's sin, and so he commits it. Now it's transgression. Galatians 3:24, I've used this verse already in previous weeks, but wherefore the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. And then Paul goes on in Galatians to talk about, once we have faith, we don't need the schoolmaster anymore. Right? And so it was our schoolmaster to bring us to Christ. The law shows us this is sin. And when we understand this is sin, we understand our sinfulness. And when we understand how sinful we are and how perfect and holy our God is because he never sinned, it shows us the depth of the distance that exists between me and him. Right? When I understand how sinful I am and how perfect he is, I understand there is an impassable gulf that exists between me and the perfect holiness of God. How can I choose to pass this gulf? I can't. I can't do it. I can lay down my righteousness, my good works, but I'm going to tell you, it ain't reaching to the other side. It's not going to get me there. And so I need something else then. I need to continue the analogy. I need somebody to come along and lay down a bridge. I'm not getting there. And so this is what Paul is trying to tell them. You're trying to hold on to your works. You're trying to leap over the ocean. It's impossible. You're right. You're trying to jump from dry land to dry land when there's an ocean between you. It's not going to happen. So the Jews had made their focus something that can't save them, but something that can only condemn them. And this is why Paul was so concerned about this. And as I've said a few times already, Paul loved his people. It's actually an immense love that is almost hard to grapple with. We'll see this when we get over to Romans chapter 9, how much Paul actually loved his people. He will make the statement, and don't ever forget that this was made under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit. He will make the statement, he said, if it were possible, I would cut myself out of the covenant if all you could be joined in. That's what he says. And so he loves his people. He's concerned with their the fact that they are so dedicated to something that cannot save them. They have misinterpreted the purpose of the law. Paul never says the law is bad. But what he's saying is you and I both agree it's good, but you misunderstand why it's good. It's good because it shows you need a Savior. Not because it's not good because it can save you. It can't. It won't. I'll quote Douglas Moo here. He said, "Before and outside the Mosaic law, wrath certainly exists. For all people being sinners stand under God's sentence of condemnation." We saw that in chapter 1. But the Mosaic law produces even more wrath. Rather than rescuing people from the sentence of condemnation, it confirms their condemnation. For by stating clearly and in great detail exactly what God requires of people, the law renders people even more accountable to God than they were without the law. Right? And so again, the law, and kind of this ironic twist, is actually pushing you farther away from God than if you didn't have it. Because now you understand what's required. Now you understand the depth of your own depravity. And so by having the law, it should drive you even further into the arms of God's grace. And yet, because of your pride and your religious arrogance, you think, even knowing how sinful you are, knowing what it is that God requires, which is perfect holiness, and somehow you think you're capable of producing it. Right? And so Paul is trying to show them, this is how prideful you are. This is how arrogant you are to claim that salvation could happen by works and that somehow you're capable of producing enough works to save yourself. You somehow think that's possible. And so again, we both agree that the law is good, but you have misinterpreted what that goodness actually is. This is why faith is necessary. This is why Abraham, David, and every other person since the fall has been justified not by their works but by faith. Because there could never be enough works that would accomplish what it is that God requires. And so Paul continues here. He says, "Therefore it is of faith that it might be by grace." And so here Paul switches from speaking about why the law was unable to why faith is able. So the law was unable, but faith is able. The promise of God to Abraham were received by Abraham through faith, and they were given to Abraham by God through grace. And so faith is the means by which we receive. Grace is the means by which God gives, okay, if that makes sense, right? And so faith is on our side, grace is on God's side. And so grace is to faith what debt is to works. Grace is to faith what debt is to works. When a person works, they incur a debt, right? When I go to work and I punch in, I do my 9 to 5, I have incurred a debt that my employer owes to me, right? Legally, he owes that money to me. Now, he might try and withhold that for various reasons, but legally, he owes that to me. And so when there's work, there is a debt. It is what naturally happens. When a person has faith, now let me explain it this way. When a person has faith, they receive grace. Now, I'm not trying to say that grace is the natural conclusion of faith. You can have faith in me, and I might not confer the grace that you are expecting of me, because I'm not a perfect, holy being like God is. But God has chosen for grace to be the end of faith. And so when we place our faith in God, God has chosen for grace to be the means that is given. And so we can expect then for God to respond in grace to our faith. Not because that's what naturally occurs, because that's what God has chosen to do. And that's what he has promised to do in his word and in the scriptures. And so when we have faith, grace should be the expected end. It should be the expected end because that's what God has promised to do. Now, remember that Abraham was saved by believing in the promises of God. He didn't necessarily believe in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, but he was saved by believing in the promises of God, that God promised to send a deliverer and that he would, and that it would be through his seed. He believed in those things, as we saw earlier in Hebrews 11, seeing them afar off. He saw them distantly. He didn't see them perfectly, but he saw them, and he had faith that what God promised would be accomplished. We have faith in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and we have faith that because God said it would save us, it will, and we have faith in the promises of God, and God will respond. Because everybody since the fall of man saved, they were saved by having faith in the promises of God, and because of that faith, God incurred grace, and he gave, you could say he imputed grace to that particular person. We can't do that on our own. We can't work for that. That is not something that we can accomplish. And so this is important because it shows that to whom it is available. Okay, and so this is Paul's next argument here. He says, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham. And again he adds, who's the father of us all. And so if salvation is by the law or by works or whatever thing you want, if salvation is through those means, salvation then is only available to those who know what that work is and who are able to accomplish that work. All right? If salvation, and so then it is available only to a small select group of people. If it is available by faith through grace, it is available to everyone. And that's Paul's point here. And so thus it is the faith of Abraham that makes him the father of us all. And he adds there parenthetically, you see that. He says, as it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations. Now, we've talked about this already a little bit, but Abraham physically had a seed, as I said earlier, that was in number as the sand, but beyond that, he is spiritually the father of many nations. Every time the gospel goes to a new person, every time the gospel goes to a new people, to a new geographical location, to a new nation, it has Abraham as its father. This promise to Abraham only can grow. It can never diminish. That's the amazing thing about this particular promise, is that it only can grow. And then it adds this, and this is so amazing. It says, before him whom he believed, even God, who quickeneth the dead, and calleth those things which be not as though they were. And so here's why Abraham was given this particular title, the father of us all. Here's why he's given this title. Because he believed in the God who brings alive things that were dead, and the God that calls things that are not as though they were. Okay, so let me explain these two things. We know that Abraham believed the first for two reasons, two kind of examples in his life. Paul's going to mention this later on. Both Abraham and Sarah were of an age where that was no longer possible. And then for Sarah, even before she reached that age, the Bible tells us that she was barren. And so not only, her age was never even a relevant factor in the conversation. She was never able to have children. But now both her and Abraham were of an age where it was impossible. And so what we see here is that even though God made this promise to them at a time where physically it could not happen, they believed that it would. And so the reproductive ability of both were dead, and yet in that deadness, God brought forth life. And so Abraham believed that that would happen. Furthermore, we see this when God calls Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. A wonderful story, obviously, in Genesis chapter 22, but two specific verses. When they first take out to go to the mountain, Abraham and Isaac are going, but they have some servants coming along with them. And at a certain point, Abraham stops the servants, and he tells them in Genesis 22:5, he says, I and the lad will go yonder and worship and come again to you. Now get that. What did God tell Abraham to do? You're going to go sacrifice your son. And yet Abraham tells these guys, hey, listen, we're going and we're coming again. And so, and we can't be sure which one it was. Either Abraham believed without question that he was going to have to sacrifice Isaac and that God was just going to immediately resurrect him. Or Abraham always knew that God would, and I think this is the more likely option, that God was going to give an alternative. And I say that because of Genesis 22:8. When Isaac asked where the sacrifice was, Abraham replied, he says, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. And so either, again, Abraham believed God's going to resurrect you, and then there's going to be a lamb that we actually give and sacrifice to God, or that before it ever happens, God's going to provide a sacrifice. One way or another, Abraham believed in the ability of God to bring a life out of death. And then the second clause here, he says he believes in God who quickens the dead, who makes alive that which is dead. But then the second clause, it says, and he calls those things would be not as though they were. And so the second clause speaks of God as a creator. he brings into being something where there was nothing, right? A phrase you may have heard, God created, they always say it this way, ex nihilo, out of nothing. God created everything out of absolute nothingness. This is why another reason amongst many why I would say that not even just evolution, but the whole Big Bang theory is absolute garbage, and no Christian needs to have anything to do with it, because the Big Bang, so they'll say, well, Christian evolutionists will say, well, God caused the Big Bang. But the whole idea of the Big Bang is that there was an incredibly dense spot in the universe that contained already within it all the base elements necessary for life. Right? And so that's what they'll say was the Big Bang. And then that exploded, and that became the universe that we know. But that's not God creating out of nothing. That's God molding what already existed. Right? That's not what the Bible shows us in Genesis chapter 1. And so God creates. He makes things that be not as though they were. Right? And so he makes something out of nothing. He doesn't mold something out of already existing elements. And so this is God as creator. Now, this could be a reference to the fact that Abraham believed God when God told him that he would make Abraham the father of many nations. And why would I say that? Because when God said that, he said, I'm going to make you the father of many nations, nations that did not yet at that point exist. Right? And so God was going to bring these nations out of, at that time, nothingness. And Abraham believed. To quote James Dunn here, he said, expressed in such terms, the statement provides the governing principle by which all God's relationship with humankind must be understood, including salvation and redemption. Unless God is inconsistent, the same principle will govern God's dealings as Savior. He redeems as he creates, and he reckons righteous in the same way in which he makes alive. That is to say, his saving work depends on nothing in that which is saved. Redemption, righteous reckoning, is not contingent on any precondition on the part of the recipient. The dead cannot make terms. That which does not exist cannot place God under any obligation, which is also to say that the individual or nation is dependent upon the unconditional grace of God as much for covenant life as for created life. In other words, again, to go back to the Big Bang, God didn't create the world out of what already existed. He doesn't save you because of what you do. He produces within us a new heart. He doesn't take from us and then mold it anew. No, he gives us a new heart. He creates life where there was death. That's what Ephesians 2 tells us, that when we were dead in trespasses and sins, that God saved us, right? We were dead. And so here we understand that God, I like the phrase that he uses, he redeems as he creates. Ex nihilo, he redeems as he creates. So in conclusion this morning, I want us to understand this. Paul's whole argument here is this. It's not just faith. It's faith in the right object. I can't just have faith and claim that that's enough if that faith is not on the object of Christ. I can't say, well, I have faith in the God who creates something out of nothingness. I have to have faith in the Son of God and the death and the burial and the resurrection. Jesus himself said, I am the way, not a way, not one of the ways, not one of a multiplicity of ways. I am the way. Outside of him, there is no salvation. Acts tells us, neither is there salvation in any other name under heaven given among men. Right? It is by him, through him alone. And so, again, it's not just faith. It's faith in the right object. It's not just faith in any God, in a God. It's faith in the only true God. The God who creates, the God who makes alive. That faith will receive grace from that God, which is the only way salvation happens. And this is why I agree. I agree with those who actually, they're trying to lay a criticism against Christianity, but they'll say, well, Christianity is too exclusive. And yes, I agree with you. It is exclusive. I won't say it's too exclusive, but I'll agree with you that it is exclusive because God himself has excluded all those who tried to make salvation through any other means other than salvation by faith through grace. He has excluded you. I agree with you on that. Genesis 15, it says, Abraham believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. He didn't work for it. He couldn't work for it. God put him to sleep, and he walked through the animals alone. It was not dependent upon Abraham. He becomes the father of those with faith but also the example. Right? He becomes the example. And what an example it was. Again, to have the ability to look forward. Listen, it's so much easier now. I have the ability to look back. People today try to attack the historicity of Jesus, but that whole idea is becoming laughably ignorant. Even atheistic scholars are coming out and telling people, please stop using that argument because it's so ridiculous. We have such a preponderance of evidence that Jesus not only existed but was crucified on a Roman cross. We have this evidence. And so it's so much easier today to look back and see how God has moved in accordance with His Word. Right? We have the ability to go back to the Old Testament and see where God said what would happen and then move forward in time and see how He made it happen. Right? We have this ability. Abraham had the kind of faith to look forward at a time where it had not yet happened. And he still had faith that it would. And so we need to have that kind of faith, the kind of faith that just says, God said it, and I believe it will happen. God said it, and I believe it will be true. God said it, and that is enough. That gives me enough hope to believe that it will be as God said, a faith and belief in the promises of God. Faith, not works, through God's grace. That is Paul's message to the Romans. That is Paul's emphasis here in the first, you could say, half of the entire book, that it is by faith through the grace of God. And you say, well, is it so important for Paul to continue to time and time again come back to this thought? Again, we've been talking about this for weeks already, and just let me tell you what's going on. We're not done yet. We got weeks to go. And so Paul's message is going to continue to be faith and faith and faith. And you say, well, is it necessary for him to continue to come back to that? Well, it was necessary at the time. And I'll just ask you this question. How many people today are still trying to make salvation by some kind of work? In fact, I would say this. The people who actually believe the biblical method of salvation are the minority. We are the minority today. Because you have Rome and you have all these other people who believe in some kind of baptismal regeneration, who would make up the majority, and they're trying to say that salvation is either completely by works or salvation is faith plus works, and it's just not what the Bible tells us. Don't try to make salvation harder than what God made it to be. God made it so abundantly simple. It's by faith. And all you have to do is see and know and be convicted in the fact that God means what He said. And that's all we can do. Because I can't produce that it would be enough good to save all the bad. If I was capable of doing that, why wasn't I capable of just not doing the bad? No, I'm not capable of producing enough righteousness to save my own soul. I can't do it. There must be something outside of us, and that something outside of us is the work of Christ on the cross. And all He asks is faith. All He asks is conviction. All He asks is belief. Let's pray.